The Wilson family's annual reunion was every bit as suffocating as I remembered. From the moment I stepped into my Aunt Patricia's colossal mansion, I could feel the oppressive weight of wealth and pride pressing down around me. Crystal chandeliers sparkled with an almost obnoxious brilliance, each tiny facet reflecting the glow of designer gowns and the glint of expensive watches. The air carried a peculiar mixture of high-end perfume and an unshakable sense of superiority, a scent that seemed to cling to my relatives as if it were a second skin. It wrapped around me like an invisible barrier, pressing me into the corner of the grand hall as I observed the endless parade of self-importance. My cousins, each armed with a polished anecdote of their latest achievements, jockeyed for attention as though it were a currency far more valuable than the gold accents adorning the mansion. Every laugh, every smile, every casual mention of titles and promotions carried with it the subtle implication that I had achieved nothing, that I was invisible, insignificant. I could feel their eyes grazing over me, measuring, dismissing. My simple black dress, carefully chosen to help me fade into the background, felt like armor. I had worn it countless times, each fiber imbued with years of silent defiance, a quiet shield against their scornful gazes. Olivia, Aunt Patricia's voice sliced through the hum of chatter like a knife. I almost didn't see you there. Still a secretary, dear? I lifted my champagne glass to my lips and sipped delicately, hiding the knowing smile that threatened to break free behind the crystal rim. Administrative assistant, actually, I replied, each word measured and polite, though laced with the subtle satisfaction of my own truth. A perfectly manicured eyebrow rose. Still at that little consulting firm. What was it called? Summit Solutions, I said quietly, letting the name fall lightly, as if it were nothing. Ethan, my cousin who had just been made a partner at his father's prestigious law firm, couldn't resist inserting himself. Come on, Liv. I could get you a real job. Something with actual career potential. I let my mind drift briefly to the towering stack of contracts waiting in my office, in the space that was truly mine. My real office. Not the facade I displayed here among the judgmental faces of my family. I'm happy where I am. Thanks. Patricia's laugh was sharp, like glass breaking. Darling, you're wasting your potential. Your cousins are all executives, partners, real business people. And you? Still pushing paper for someone else. If only they knew that someone else was me. That phrase carried all the irony in the world. 10 years ago, sitting in this very house, I had planted the first seeds of a plan that would change everything. Fresh out of business school, armed with an MBA and a bold vision for restructuring failing companies, I had imagined my family's vast network of connections would propel me into the business world effortlessly. I had spent months crafting the perfect pitch, rehearsing each word, every gesture. I believed that their power could become my own. Instead, they laughed. Consulting? Uncle Robert had scoffed. Leave that to the big firms. Join the family business. Start in the mailroom like everyone else. Everyone else meant my male cousins. Women in the Wilson family were never meant to rise to power. They were expected to marry well or occupy subordinate positions. That was the ceiling they had carefully constructed for us. Their fortune, meticulously built, relied on a network of companies led by chosen men. To them, ambition in a woman was a threat, not a virtue. That night, two decisions crystallized in my mind with the clarity of purpose. First, I would build my own company, independently, without a single ounce of their help or recognition. Second, I would make every dismissive word, every sneer, every belittling comment they had uttered against me, matter. They would know, eventually, just how wrong they had been. In that opulent mansion, surrounded by smug smiles and condescending glances, a quiet determination began to pulse through me. I could feel the energy of ambition, sharpened and focused, coalescing into a strategy that would consume the next decade of my life. The Wilson family believed in visibility, in power displayed and flaunted. I would master invisibility, blending into the shadows while quietly building something formidable, something no one would ever anticipate. Every conversation, every encounter at that reunion, became a data point. Ethan's condescending offer, Patricia's cutting laughter, Robert's scoff, they were all reminders of the wall I had to climb, the expectations I had to subvert. Their failure to see beyond my modest role was not an insult, it was an opportunity. I stood there, poised with my glass of champagne, the reflections of chandeliers dancing off the crystal in my hand, and I made a silent vow. For 10 years, I would operate in secrecy, studying the business world, learning every nuance, every weakness in the system that my family so blindly worshipped. I would become the very thing they claimed I could never be: successful, influential, and unassailable. And yet, in that moment, I also understood the importance of patience. 10 years of careful observation, of silent preparation, of hidden work. Every family reunion, every condescending remark, every moment of underestimation would be a stepping stone toward the empire I would quietly create. Summit Solutions, though not yet conceived in reality, already existed in my mind, a vision of power, intellect, and meticulous strategy. The mansion's chandeliers reflected the grandiosity of my relative's world, but beneath the sparkle, beneath the designer dresses and the polished shoes, lay a system of arrogance and complacency. I could see it in the way they dismissed people, in the way they equated titles and wealth with worth. That system would be my training ground, my secret teacher. And in 10 years, when Summit Solutions stood as a powerhouse in the corporate world, they would look around that same mansion and realize they had misjudged the quiet, underestimated girl who once stood in the corner, blending into the shadows. By the time the evening ended, I had sketched the first outlines of a plan so audacious, so meticulous, that it almost frightened me with its clarity. I would need courage, ingenuity, and resilience, but most importantly, I would need time. The Wilsons had spent their lives believing they understood success. I would show them, quietly and deliberately, that they had never truly seen it at all. That reunion, suffocating and glittering with superficial grandeur, had inadvertently lit a fire within me. The seeds of determination had been planted in the most unlikely of places, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that one day, they would bear fruit far beyond anyone's expectations. The Wilson family, for all their pride and wealth, had created the perfect conditions for my rise, not by supporting me, but by underestimating me. And so, standing there in my simple black dress, invisible to all who mattered, I made a silent promise to the universe. They would regret every condescending word, every dismissive glance, every moment of doubt they had ever cast upon me. Summit Solutions would rise from the shadows, and I would ensure that when the time came, they would have no choice but to see me as the force I had always been destined to become. That night, amid the sparkling chandeliers and the whispers of superiority, a quiet revolution began. The moment I left my aunt's mansion that night, I carried with me not just the familiar sting of familial judgment but a burgeoning fire of determination that refused to be extinguished. The grandeur, the arrogance, the glimmering chandeliers, they were all symbols of a world that sought to define my limits before I had even stepped forward. But I had made my decision, clear and unwavering. I would build my own empire, in secret, from the ground up, beyond their sight and scrutiny. And so began the journey that would transform a simple, underestimated administrative assistant into the formidable CEO of a consulting powerhouse, Summit Solutions. The first step was the smallest, yet the most significant, finding a space to bring my vision to life. I rented a modest office above a Chinese restaurant, a space that could hardly compare to the palatial surroundings of my relatives, yet it held promise. Its walls were thin, its windows small, and the rent barely covered by my modest savings, but it was mine. That tiny room became my sanctuary, my laboratory, the birthplace of a plan that would, in time, eclipse anything the Wilson family had ever imagined. Here, I could think freely, strategize, and begin to transform my ideas into tangible results. I started by carefully defining the mission of Summit Solutions. Unlike other consulting firms, my approach would not rely solely on flashy presentations or grandiose promises. My vision was rooted in understanding why companies failed, and more importantly, how to fix them. I spent long nights poring over business cases, dissecting strategies, and identifying patterns that led to corporate decline. I studied industries, financial reports, and operational pitfalls, often losing track of time as my obsession grew. This wasn't just about making money, it was about proving that competence, strategy, and insight could succeed without the blind reliance on wealth or nepotism that the Wilsons so depended upon. My first client was a small manufacturing company teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The owner, weary from repeated rejections by larger firms, had been left with nowhere to turn. He was desperate, yet skeptical, understandably so, given the number of consultants who had promised transformation and delivered disappointment. Over the course of 3 months, I immersed myself in the company's operations, scrutinizing every process, every inefficiency. I negotiated with creditors, restructured supply chains, streamlined staffing, and implemented operational changes that were both practical and forward-looking. Each meeting, each strategy session, each late-night call was a testament to the meticulous attention to detail that would become Summit Solutions' hallmark. The first signs of success were subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. Slowly, the company began to regain stability. Financial losses shrank, productivity improved, and the staff, initially skeptical, started to trust in the process. 6 months later, the business was not only solvent but thriving, with profits rising steadily and a renewed sense of purpose throughout the organization. The owner's gratitude was palpable, but the real reward was more profound. I had proven to myself that my approach worked, that my intellect and strategy could create tangible success even in the harshest of circumstances. Word of Summit Solutions' effectiveness spread quietly at first. In a world dominated by showy, self-promoting consultants, I relied on discretion and results. I hired only the most capable and trustworthy individuals, those who shared my vision of confidentiality and excellence. Every employee signed strict non-disclosure agreements, ensuring that our clients and I remained protected. My name appeared on no public documents. I was simply the CEO, known only within the internal structure of the company and to those who truly mattered. My cover as a low-level administrative assistant remained intact, a role I maintained with careful precision whenever family members inquired. They never suspected that the quiet, unobtrusive employee they had long dismissed was orchestrating the survival and success of entire companies. There were moments of doubt, of course. The financial strain of running a business from such humble beginnings was real. Each rent payment, each payroll, each client acquisition required meticulous planning and nerve. Nights blurred into mornings as I balanced client needs, operations, and long-term strategy, often surviving on little sleep and modest meals. There were days when I questioned whether I could sustain the pace, whether I had bitten off more than I could chew. But every minor setback only strengthened my resolve. The Wilsons had dismissed me, underestimated me, and in their arrogance, provided the fuel I needed to succeed. Beyond the operational challenges, there was the emotional labor of maintaining my cover. I had to perfect the act of invisibility, performing menial administrative tasks when relatives visited my office, answering phone calls with polite efficiency, and appearing perpetually busy with inconsequential duties. It was exhausting, but strategic. By presenting myself as a low-level assistant, I ensured that no one, including my family, would ever suspect the true scale of Summit Solutions. Every coffee I served, every document I filed, every detail I meticulously documented contributed to a facade that would one day serve as the most powerful weapon in my arsenal. The first year of Summit Solutions was defined by this dual existence, relentless work behind the scenes coupled with the careful cultivation of invisibility. I spent hours analyzing markets, identifying struggling companies, and developing strategies to rescue them. Each success built my reputation discreetly. By the end of the first year, my small team had transformed multiple clients from near collapse to profitability. My approach combined operational precision with innovative problem-solving, ensuring that companies not only survived but were positioned for long-term growth. One of the most crucial elements of this phase was learning the power of patience and discretion. Unlike my cousins, who flaunted their wealth and positions, I learned to let results speak for themselves, quietly, without fanfare. The Wilsons were aggressive, relying on high-stakes takeovers and forceful tactics. I, in contrast, relied on strategy, understanding, and long-term vision. By choosing stealth over spectacle, I ensured that Summit Solutions' reputation grew organically, solidifying a foundation that was unassailable not by wealth alone, but by intellect, insight, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. In retrospect, those early days above the Chinese restaurant were foundational not just for Summit Solutions, but for me personally. I discovered the depths of my own resilience, the clarity of my strategic vision, and the power of patient execution. Each small victory reinforced the principle that true influence does not require visibility or approval from those who doubt you. It is forged in the quiet, unseen labor of preparation, insight, and disciplined action. The humble beginnings of Summit Solutions were not a limitation, they were a crucible, shaping a leader capable of outmaneuvering even the most entrenched and powerful family empire. By the time the second year rolled around, Summit Solutions had grown beyond the modest confines of that tiny office. But the lessons learned during those early months, the importance of secrecy, the value of patient strategy, and the strength derived from underestimated potential, remained integral to every decision I made. I had begun to realize that my invisibility was not a weakness, it was a strategic advantage. While my family believed I was insignificant, the foundation for a true empire was quietly solidifying beneath their very noses. And so, as I prepared for the next stage of Summit Solutions' growth, I carried with me the lessons of humility, discretion, and unwavering ambition. Every late night spent drafting reports, every early morning spent negotiating with skeptical clients, every calculated move in a world that had dismissed me, all of it was shaping the narrative that would one day astonish the Wilsons. The seeds planted during that first reunion had begun to blossom in unexpected, unstoppable ways. The years that followed marked a period of quiet, relentless growth for Summit Solutions, a period in which every day was a balancing act between secrecy and strategic brilliance. The tiny office above the Chinese restaurant had given way to a sleek downtown headquarters, modern, understated, and efficient, the kind of place that exuded professionalism without shouting for attention. From the outside, it was just another consulting firm among countless others. But inside, it was the nerve center of an empire that was quietly, invisibly reshaping the corporate landscape. And at its core was me, Olivia, still wearing the guise of a modest administrative assistant whenever the world of the Wilsons intruded, still keeping my true role invisible to those who had long dismissed me. Summit Solutions grew through a combination of meticulous planning, precise execution, and an unwavering commitment to confidentiality. Every employee, every hire, was carefully chosen for competence, discretion, and alignment with the company's ethos. NDAs were ironclad, contracts were thorough, and communication was precise. This secrecy was not merely a legal necessity, it was a strategic weapon. My name never appeared publicly, yet I oversaw every critical decision, every negotiation, every restructuring plan that turned struggling companies into thriving enterprises. We specialized in rescuing businesses teetering on the brink of collapse, companies that the Wilson family and their empire would have considered ripe for acquisition. It was a deliberate choice. While they thrived on predatory practices, snapping up undervalued companies and dismantling them for parts, Summit Solutions offered an alternative: preservation, growth, and ethical turnaround. Each success story was a quiet victory, a subtle undermining of their worldview, yet invisible to them. My cousins, my uncle, my aunt, they continued to parade their wealth and status, completely unaware that I was silently orchestrating triumphs that would eventually dwarf their own accomplishments. The first few years were a whirlwind of intense work, calculated risks, and sleepless nights. I immersed myself in the operations of my clients, learning their weaknesses and strengths with a surgeon's precision. I crafted strategies that combined operational restructuring with financial ingenuity, implementing innovative solutions to save failing businesses. Every success reinforced Summit Solutions' reputation within the business community, yet not a single member of the Wilson family knew the extent of my involvement. To them, I was still a secretary or administrative assistant, performing mundane tasks, invisible and unremarkable. One particularly memorable case involved a mid-sized manufacturing firm on the verge of bankruptcy. The company had been rejected by every prominent consulting firm in the city, and the owners were resigned to failure. I spent months studying every aspect of their operations, identifying bottlenecks, renegotiating supplier contracts, and optimizing production lines. Each decision, each change, was meticulously planned, implemented with precision, and monitored for effectiveness. Over time, the company not only avoided bankruptcy but returned to profitability, drawing attention from investors and competitors alike. Yet, Summit Solutions remained enigmatic. Our success was whispered about in business circles, but our methods, our people, and our CEO remained hidden from view. Simultaneously, I maintained my cover. Whenever family members inquired about my work, I described administrative tasks in mundane detail, watching their eyes glaze over with disinterest. "Oh, just filing reports, answering emails, arranging schedules," I would say, letting the words mask the intricate web of strategies I had designed and executed. This deception was not born of vanity, it was a calculated tactic. By convincing them of my insignificance, I ensured they would never suspect the breadth of influence I had amassed. They remained oblivious to the quiet, invisible power I wielded, a power that had grown steadily, imperceptibly, and unchallenged. During this period, Summit Solutions expanded rapidly, opening offices in multiple cities, taking on more complex clients, and tackling increasingly ambitious restructuring projects. From saving a regional shipping company to reviving a struggling electronics manufacturer, each success further cemented the company's reputation, yet my relatives remained unaware. They continued to parade their acquisitions and partnerships as if the business world revolved around their actions, completely blind to the fact that I had already outmaneuvered them in countless instances. Each time they made a bold move, I quietly countered, implementing strategies that preserved the companies they sought to exploit. Every thwarted takeover was a private, personal victory, a testament to the patience, strategy, and cunning that had defined Summit Solutions from its inception. It was during this period that the duality of my existence became most pronounced. To the world of Summit Solutions, I was the meticulous, commanding CEO, making high-stakes decisions, negotiating with clients, and guiding the company's strategic direction. To the Wilson family, I remained the invisible administrative assistant, the low-level employee who served coffee, filed documents, and performed menial tasks with quiet efficiency. This duality was both exhausting and exhilarating, a constant reminder of the power of perception, and the advantage of invisibility in a world obsessed with status and appearances. I began to notice the subtle shifts in the industries we touched. Competitors whispered about Summit Solutions' uncanny ability to turn around failing companies. Fortune 500 executives discreetly sought our guidance. Investors asked questions about our methodology without ever knowing the architect behind it. Each success was a carefully measured ripple, building momentum and influence that would eventually become unstoppable. And yet, in every public interaction, every whispered compliment, every congratulatory email, my identity remained shielded, my brilliance concealed behind the mask of invisibility. The true brilliance of this strategy, I realized, lay in timing. I didn't need recognition immediately, recognition could wait. The Wilsons' arrogance and impatience were tools I could exploit. They measured power in visible acquisitions, flashy titles, and public displays of wealth. I measured it in results, influence, and control, knowing that when the moment came, the revelation of my identity would hit with maximum impact. Each quiet victory accumulated into an unstoppable force that would one day confront them with undeniable evidence of my success. As Summit Solutions grew, so too did my confidence, my understanding of corporate ecosystems, and my ability to navigate high-stakes negotiations with precision and poise. I had learned the art of invisible influence, the delicate balance between action and observation, and the importance of discretion. Every client relationship, every restructuring plan, every operational overhaul was a calculated step in a larger strategy that extended beyond profit. It was the groundwork for the ultimate revelation, the moment when my family would be forced to acknowledge the power they had consistently overlooked. Throughout this period, I never lost sight of the personal mission that had ignited 10 years earlier in my aunt's mansion. Each thwarted acquisition, each rescued company, each strategic maneuver against the predatory practices of Wilson Ventures was a reaffirmation of my purpose. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and scorned my ambition. I had embraced those doubts, transformed them into fuel, and built an empire that no one, including the Wilsons, could ignore. Summit Solutions was more than a business, it was the embodiment of patience, intelligence, and perseverance, a living testament to the power of quiet strategy and unyielding resolve. By the time 10 years had passed since that fateful family reunion, Summit Solutions had evolved from a small, shadowy office above a Chinese restaurant into one of the most influential consulting firms in the industry. We had offices in 12 cities, a client list that included Fortune 500 companies, and a reputation for consistently rescuing failing businesses. And yet, not a single member of the Wilson family had the faintest idea of my true role. They continued to mock, dismiss, and underestimate me, unaware that the very companies they sought to exploit had been quietly protected, strengthened, and transformed under my guidance. It was during this period of stealth growth and quiet dominance that I fully realized the power of invisibility and strategy. By remaining underestimated, I had created an advantage that my relatives, for all their wealth and pride, could never comprehend. Every thwarted acquisition, every rescued company, every carefully executed plan was a step toward the inevitable moment when the Wilsons would finally be forced to acknowledge what they had ignored for a decade. The quiet, unassuming woman they had dismissed as inconsequential had built an empire, and she had done it right under their noses. In retrospect, those years of stealth growth were the most exhilarating, the most defining, and the most rewarding of my career. They were a testament to patience, intelligence, and strategic vision. Summit Solutions was no longer merely a company, it was a symbol of perseverance, ingenuity, and the power of underestimated potential. And as the firm reached unprecedented heights, I remained poised, patient, and ready for the day when my family would finally discover that the secretary they had scorned had become the most formidable business leader they had ever encountered. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, with none of the fanfare one might expect for a confrontation that had been years in the making. I woke early, the sunlight glinting off the city skyline outside my office window, a symbol of everything Summit Solutions had quietly accomplished while the Wilson family remained blissfully unaware. Gone was the modest black dress from the family reunion years ago, the uniform of invisibility. Today, I wore a tailored navy Chanel suit, a symbol of authority, power, and precision. Each detail was deliberate, from the crisp lines of the jacket to the subtle strength it conveyed. This was the armor of a CEO who had spent a decade building an empire, patiently, methodically, invisibly. My assistant, Maya, met me at the elevator with a tablet in hand and a knowing smile. She had been with me through every stage of Summit Solutions' secret ascent, the silent witness to the invisible empire we had quietly built. "Your family is here early," she said, eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Your uncle seems particularly eager to meet the Summit CEO." I allowed a small smile to play across my lips. Of course he was eager. Little did they know, the woman they had dismissed for 10 years as insignificant would be the one holding the ultimate power at the table today. The Wilson Ventures team had arrived punctually, eager, confident, and completely unprepared for what awaited them. My cousin Ethan, in particular, had insisted on personally handling the legal aspects of the meeting, a display of arrogance that would only magnify the impact of the revelation. Aunt Patricia was there, poised and aloof as ever, ready to scrutinize every move, every word, every gesture. My cousin James, representing Wilson Ventures' finance department, completed the family tableau, a perfect audience for a performance that would combine strategy, justice, and inevitability. As we approached the main conference room, Maya updated me on the seating arrangement. "They're all in the main room," she said. "Mr. Harrison from Williams Manufacturing is there as well. Your cousin Ethan is brimming with confidence, probably expecting an easy negotiation." I allowed myself a measured breath, absorbing the anticipation that hung in the air like electricity. Every detail mattered. Every timing, every placement, every subtle cue would amplify the impact of what was about to unfold. Inside the room, the scene was familiar yet charged with tension. My uncle sat at one end of the long table, assuming the position of authority, flanked by Ethan and James in their expensive suits, symbols of family wealth and perceived dominance. Aunt Patricia, ever the observer, examined her manicure with practiced disinterest, convinced of her position in the social hierarchy of business and family alike. Mr. Harrison from Williams Manufacturing, the client whose business had been imperiled by my uncle's attempted hostile takeover, sat uneasily across from them, aware that this meeting could shape the fate of his company. Finally, I stepped into the room, the sound of my heels on the polished floor commanding attention without a word. All conversation halted instantly. The family's expressions shifted from expectation to confusion as they took in the transformation before them. "Olivia, what are you wearing?" Aunt Patricia demanded, eyes widening. And why aren't you carrying coffee? The question was almost comical, given the irony of the situation. I walked with deliberate calm to the head of the table, directly opposite my uncle, and replied, I don't serve coffee anymore, Aunt Patricia. In fact, I never really did. The room seemed to shrink around the weight of that statement. Uncle Robert's authoritative tone faltered. What is this? Where is Summit's CEO? We were promised a meeting with the actual decision-maker. I smiled, letting the silence build for effect. You have been speaking to her for 10 years, I said, sitting at the head of the table. I am the CEO of Summit Solutions. I have been since I founded the company 10 years ago. The room froze. Ethan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. James dropped his pen in shock. Aunt Patricia's composure faltered, her eyes betraying disbelief. And my uncle, after a moment of stunned silence, attempted to regain control, but the impact had already struck. The secretary they had underestimated had become their equal, and more importantly, their superior in strategy and influence. Maya entered at precisely the right moment, distributing a stack of contracts to the stunned attendees. I explained, with deliberate clarity, that these documents outlined the terms under which Summit Solutions would consider approving the merger between Wilson Ventures and Williams Manufacturing. Ethan sputtered, incredulous. You can't be serious. This is a joke, right? Some elaborate prank. I didn't reply verbally. Instead, I projected Summit Solutions' latest financial statements onto the wall screen. The figures spoke for themselves. $12 billion in client assets, a 94% success rate in corporate restructuring, and the undeniable authority to approve any major changes to Williams Manufacturing's business structure. The silence that followed was deafening, the gravity of the revelation sinking in with a weight that no amount of family arrogance could counter. Aunt Patricia whispered, disbelief heavy in her tone. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. I leaned forward, eyes steady. That's exactly what you were meant to think, I said, letting each word land like a hammer. You were convinced I could not be successful, and because of that, you never noticed that I already was. I turned to Mr. Harrison. Would you like to explain to my family why you chose Summit Solutions over Wilson Ventures' original offer? The client straightened, his gratitude clear. Summit's restructuring plan saved our company from a hostile takeover. Profits have increased by 47% since implementation. Your firm's attempts would have failed. I began enumerating examples, cases where I had quietly undermined my family's aggressive acquisitions, Peterson Electronics, Maritime Shipping, the Davidson Group, all rescued under Summit Solutions' strategic guidance. Uncle Robert's face had turned a deep shade of purple with anger and frustration. You deliberately sabotaged family business, he growled. No, I corrected, calm yet resolute. I built my own business, one that helps companies survive instead of devouring them. The fact that it interfered with your plans is a karmic bonus. The revelation of my true identity and the full extent of Summit Solutions' influence sent shockwaves through the Wilson family and the corporate world alike. The aftermath of the confrontation was immediate, chaotic, and intensely gratifying, a whirlwind of astonishment, scrambling, and reluctant admiration. Emails, phone calls, and messages flooded my inbox, most from family members grappling with the stunning realization that the woman they had dismissed for a decade was not only competent but an empire-building force in her own right. Aunt Patricia tried to salvage her reputation, reaching out with conciliatory tones, suggesting lunches and discussions as if they could rewrite history, but I remained focused on the larger picture, Summit Solutions' mission and legacy. For the Wilsons, the humiliation was palpable. Ethan's attempts at damage control were pitiful and transparent, and his professional credibility suffered as whispers spread of his ineptitude during the meeting. James, initially frantic, eventually approached me with a tentative proposal to merge forces, imagining that aligning with Summit Solutions could restore some dignity while ensuring he remained relevant. I politely declined, reminding him that Summit Solutions was not about dominance, it was about elevation, transformation, and ethical leadership. This moment reinforced a critical lesson I had learned over the years. True influence does not come from asserting control over others, but from creating conditions in which others are empowered to thrive. Beyond family dynamics, the public reaction was extraordinary. Headlines celebrated the revelation: secret CEO reveals billion-dollar empire built in secret, and Wilson family shocked by hidden success story. Media outlets clamored for interviews, analyses, and insider perspectives, yet I carefully curated my exposure, choosing only those platforms that respected the story's focus on strategy, perseverance, and ethical business practices. The narrative was no longer about family drama, it was about innovation, resilience, and the power of quietly building something extraordinary without seeking immediate recognition or applause. Within the business world, Summit Solutions' stature skyrocketed. Companies that had previously feared predatory acquisitions by the Wilsons now sought partnerships with my firm. Executives admired our strategic foresight, our ability to turn struggling businesses into profitable, sustainable operations, and our commitment to preserving jobs and creating value rather than dismantling companies for personal gain. Invitations from business schools, industry conferences, and think tanks began arriving, requesting that I share my philosophy and approach. My story became a blueprint for ethical, patient, and intelligent leadership in a cutthroat corporate environment, a guide for those underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked. Internally, Summit Solutions thrived in ways that extended far beyond profitability. My employees, many of whom had worked with me for years while maintaining the same level of discretion as I had, began to step forward, empowered by our collective achievements. Young women who had joined the firm as assistants or analysts felt inspired, seeing firsthand that their ambition, intelligence, and perseverance could achieve remarkable results. Mentorship programs were established, focusing on supporting individuals who had been underestimated or marginalized in the corporate world. Summit Solutions became more than a company, it was a movement for transforming corporate culture, showing that success could be achieved without compromising principles or resorting to ruthless tactics. The broader industry took notice as well. Summit Solutions' unique approach to corporate restructuring, emphasizing preservation, growth, and ethical decision-making, challenged the established norms of cutthroat acquisitions. Our successes with companies previously considered failures became case studies, taught in business schools and analyzed by leading consultants. The firm's reputation for integrity, effectiveness, and strategic brilliance made us the go-to advisors for corporations navigating crises. And through it all, I maintained the strategic calm and patience that had characterized Summit Solutions since its inception, knowing that influence built quietly and ethically often had the most lasting impact. Personal satisfaction, however, remained central to the journey. For 10 years, I had performed the role of invisible assistant, enduring dismissive glances, condescending remarks, and a constant underestimation of my abilities. I had watched my family flaunt their wealth, power, and perceived superiority, never realizing that their focus on appearances blinded them to the real achievements quietly unfolding under their noses. When the moment of revelation came, and they finally recognized my role, it was not only professionally satisfying, it was deeply personal, a validation of a decade-long strategy, patience, and meticulous planning. The emotional weight of this triumph resonated with every lesson I had internalized over those 10 years. Resilience, foresight, and discretion could achieve results far beyond immediate recognition or approval. Even as I celebrated, I did not rest. Summit Solutions continued to expand, both in influence and in geographic reach. New offices, strategic partnerships, and acquisitions of ethically aligned companies further solidified our dominance in the industry, not as a power grab but as a commitment to transforming corporate practices. Each decision was measured, deliberate, and aligned with the founding ethos: to save companies, elevate leadership, and create value in ways that respected people, communities, and principles. I had built not just a company, but a legacy, one that could endure well beyond my tenure, changing the expectations and practices of corporate leadership for generations. The ripple effects extended even to the Wilson family. Uncle Robert's resignation and public acknowledgement of lessons learned became symbolic of the power shift. Messages from my mother, who had always believed in my potential and distanced herself from the toxicity of the family, served as quiet reminders that some recognition had always mattered. The younger generation of executives, assistants, and protégés began seeing a new paradigm. Leadership was not always flashy, not always loud, it was often strategic, patient, and grounded in results. Summit Solutions became a beacon for this principle, attracting talented individuals inspired not by titles or wealth, but by the opportunity to build, create, and elevate responsibly. Months later, I stood on stage at a prestigious award ceremony, accepting the Business Innovation Award. The audience included industry leaders, young entrepreneurs, and former assistants who had helped maintain the firm's secret while growing their own careers. My mother sat in the front row, beaming with pride. In that moment, I realized that true success was not in outmaneuvering family or competitors, it was in creating lasting impact, inspiring others, and proving that ethical, patient, and strategic leadership could achieve extraordinary results. I shared this philosophy in my acceptance speech, emphasizing the lessons learned from 10 years of careful planning and strategic invisibility. Power is not what you show, I told the audience, but what you build quietly when no one is watching. Back in the office, life continued at Summit Solutions, but now with a different tempo, celebratory, confident, and purposeful. The tabloids labeled it revenge, the business press called it strategic genius. To me, it was justice, earned over a decade of perseverance, intelligence, and deliberate action. And somewhere, in a small office above a Chinese restaurant, the original desk still stood as a testament. Success often begins quietly, invisibly, with patience, vision, and the relentless pursuit of excellence, even when the world overlooks you. The legacy of Summit Solutions was more than financial success, it was a paradigm shift in the corporate world. Young executives and aspiring leaders saw that strategic patience, ethical decision-making, and quiet influence could rival or surpass the power accumulated through arrogance, inherited wealth, or cutthroat tactics. The Wilson family, long invested in appearances and superficial power, had become an unwitting case study in underestimating others. The companies we saved, the employees we empowered, and the industry practices we reshaped were proof that true power did not always announce itself with ostentation, it grew quietly, strategically, and ethically, waiting for the right moment to assert itself. As I prepared for the next family reunion, this time hosted in Summit Solutions' main conference room, the very room where I had once served coffee and observed, patiently calculating the perfect moment to reveal my true self, I reflected on the journey. 10 years of careful planning, discretion, and strategic patience had led to this point. My empire was secure, my principles intact, and my influence undeniable. The future was not just about acquisitions or profits, it was about setting a new standard for business, leadership, and empowerment. And as Maya brought in coffee from our chain, the same beverage that had once symbolized my family's dismissal, I smiled. The quiet, patient, invisible work had borne fruit. Success, I realized, had never been about recognition, about titles, or about proving anyone wrong. It had been about creating, empowering, and transforming the world around me, one strategic, ethical, and meticulously planned step at a time. And in that moment, I knew the real victory was not in showing them who I was, but in demonstrating the extraordinary power of vision, patience, and integrity.